Welcome to Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Lianos, and it's my mission to make sewing approachable to the hobbyist. Today's project will be making a mask. As you all know, ironing is the first step. Today's mask is going to be made from linen on the outside and an old t-shirt for the lining. Let's get started with the ironing. Now that we're done ironing, back to the sewing machine. Now that we're all ironed up, the next step is to trace out the pattern. Here's the pattern I'm going to use. I'll include it and a link to it at the end of the video. In a pattern, you'll find things like a grain line. That's very important. With the grain line, you want to make sure the line lines up with the up and down fibers of the cloth, not the side to side. How do you tell up and down from side to side? This little fringe on the side, called the selvages, is usually marking where the side to side starts. And then that shows you the direction of the up and down. So here's the pattern piece. I'm going to line up the grain line, and then I hold it down and make sure it doesn't move around, and I just trace around it. There we go. Now we have to cut it out. Now that our main front fabric is cut out, time to put it aside and move on to the lining. Because for my lining I'm using an old t-shirt, I'm going to have to take out some of the tags. I got to use my seam ripper to make sure these tags come out clean and don't rip the shirt. Also, I'm going to be using the bottom 1.5 inches in order to use the material to make the strings that go over the ears and behind the neck. So I'm going to be tracing that out first. You can use shoelaces, you can use whatever's useful to you for strings. I'm choosing to use this old t-shirt to its maximum. So I set my seam gauge to 1.5 inches. Mark periodically, maybe on the end, in the middle, on the end. Then use this to draw the larger line. Now to mark out the lining pattern using the grain line going up and down to the t-shirt. One thing with these pencils, you don't want to make sure they're too sharp, because if you make sure they're too sharp, the cloth will bunch up underneath the point and you want it to run smoothly, so a somewhat dull pencil is a good pencil. Now to cut out what we have. Now that the lining is cut out, and now that the strings are cut out, and now that the front part of the pattern is cut out, let's head back to the ironing board for a quick press. Now you ask, why so much ironing? Because when you're cutting the cloth, you can crinkle it. This T-shirt actually has the tendency to wrinkle, so ironing it a second time helps relax some of those wrinkles. So here we go, getting ready for the beginning stitches by doing the last ironing before we dive in. Alright, now to the sewing machine. Now that we're back at our machine, the next step is to take an old scrap and test your machine to make sure it's threaded properly and all the tension is correct. Everything looks good. Let's get to our project. Now the first step is to pin to make sure your edges are all lined up. Seam allowance for this pattern is 3/8 of an inch. So I line it up to the 3/8 of an inch mark on the machine. Put the needle in, make sure the threads are back. I give a couple of stitches forward, a couple of stitches backwards, and away we go. At the end, again, back stitch and forward stitch to lock in the thread. That's your first seam. Set that aside. Time to work on the lining. The lining, again, we pin it, and the same thing, 3/8 of an inch down this curved seam. Couple of stitches forward, couple of stitches back to lock it in, and away we go. Now that we're at the end, again, a couple of back stitches and forward stitches to lock it. And we're done with our first seam, both on the lining and on the front piece. Now you know the drill. Let's head to the iron. Here we are back at the ironing board to meld the stitches and to press the seam allowances flat. Here we are melding the stitches to make sure they're locked in, and that our seam stays for eternity if it can. And then we clip the hashtag thread ends. Now we have a challenge pressing these flat because when we open it up, it's curved. That's why I have the tailor's ham. The tailor's ham, I can very easily press it flat. That's so when you're wearing the mask, you don't get lumps over your face. Now to repeat that step with the lining. As you could see, I was taking my time pressing over the tailor's ham. I was going maybe an inch or 2 inches, inch and a half at a time. You don't need to rush these jobs. Your garment, in this case the mask, you'll be wearing for a very long time. So take your time to make it look good. Now back to the sewing machine. Now that we're back at our machine, the next step is an optional step. You can actually take these seam allowances and sew them down. I'm going to do that on the lining of the mask just to show you, and then we'll move on. What I do when I'm working with a curve, I usually take this part of the machine off. That way, when the curve is going down, it actually falls off the machine a little quicker. So to stitch this down, I usually go half of the seam allowance. Since we're 3/8, I guess that would be however many 1/16, 1/8 and 1/16. Math is hard. Couple of stitches forward, couple of stitches back to lock it in, and away we go, nice and slow. Especially with this weird curve, you want to keep making sure it's smooth. You want to keep making sure your line is straight. And I can tell you it's going to wrinkle a little bit. How you solve that is when you're going slow, you notice it's starting to wrinkle. I lift the presser foot up just gently and put it back down, and the wrinkle should come out. There's another wrinkle, presser foot up and down. You may have to adjust the cloth ever so slightly, pull it forward or backwards just slightly. When you're pulling it backwards and forwards, make sure your needle is in the cloth first. Now that we're at our end, do what's normal. Back stitch, forward stitch, lock it in. Now you can see your seam is pasted down. On the other side, it shows. Some people really dislike top stitches, some love them. If you think that's a nice thing to add to your mask, I would do that on the front. Now to do the other one real quick, and I'll iron this off the screen, save you one ironing bit. The next step is that you want to pin these right sides together. That means the side you want eventually facing out. So these flappy things have to go on the outside when you're pinning. In this pattern, the inside lining is actually designed to be slightly smaller than the outside. So instead of lining up the very edge and making it off center, I would line up the center seam that you just sewed on both pieces. And I would pin starting there, going out. So let's pin and get ready to sew. So now that we're all pinned up, I would start on the straight edge first, and then do the curved edge. Now that we're doing something a little more on the straight side, I would put this back on the machine. Now, here's another thing I just realized as I was feeding the machine. You notice the white doesn't quite match up. I would start with the white side facing up. That way I can stitch just to the edge of the white. Two stitches forward, 2 stitches backwards to lock, and then we take out our pin and away we go. Now's a good time to make sure the seam underneath is laying flat. straight end, I would move on to the curved end. When you're sewing, I always recommend at first go slow. It's okay if you use this knob and hand feed it until you get used to the curves. Again, once you get to the center seam, just before it's too late, make sure that lower seam allowance is flat. Now the top curve seam is done. Now you know the drill. Off to the ironing board. Now that we're at our ironing board, the next step is to clip the hashtag thread ends and meld the seams. Not in that order, words are hard. Now that it's melded, give it a quick clip. Now is your moment, if it's not laying flat how you like it, to press these seams to make sure they stay flat. Now the next step is that since these are supposed to be the inside, we need to then inside it out. So very slowly and gently, you make sure to inside it out. It's starting to look pretty darn close. Now, we still got some ironing to do. When you're looking at this, it's hard to see with such bright light. Let me tone it down a bit. So with this, you see how the white is on top and the brown is on bottom. Sometimes when the white peeks over a little bit, it doesn't look nice from the front. So I roll it back just so I see a slight hair of the front side of the mask, and I iron it like this to make sure it stays. So very slowly, you bring the light back up. Very slowly, you want to go along the seam, make sure it looks exactly like you want it. If you have to redo it, take the time to redo it. Remember, 5 minutes of extra care now can make your mask look good and something that you're really proud of over the next few months. Now I tackle the curved edge. It's looking exactly like I want it. Now to go to the sewing machine. Now that you're happy with the ironing job, making sure the mask is looking good, make sure to sew a little top seam all the way around the edge to lock it in. Since I rolled over the white lining a little bit, I want to make sure to stitch from that side to make sure it locks in nicely. Starting with the straight edge, then the curved edge. How's my bobbin doing? Bobbin's good. Uh-oh, I forgot to backstitch. What do I do now? Here's a tip. I would just put it back under, right near the edge. Put the needle in right where you were sewing. Couple stitches forward, couple stitches backwards, and you did it. Never fear, usually there's a fix-it for when you forget stuff. Now to do the curved edge. Here's why you always check your bobbin thread. I ran out halfway. Now I have to rip out the entire seam and start over again. Now we do the curve seam. Now you know the deal. Off to the ironing board. Now that we're back at the ironing board, time to meld the stitches and cut the hashtag thread ends. Gotta clean up some of these edges. Starting to look like a mask. The next step is to create and attach the strings. Meet you at the sewing machine. Now, in order to make the threads that go over the ears and behind the neck, what I do, I'm using this as an example of what I'm going to do with this piece, is I fold the ends in, and then I fold it in again, and I stitch right in the middle, and that creates the string. And now we have our string. What I do is I cut it in half. It's stretchy, so it sort of wants to do its own thing sometimes. And then I just lock the edges. trim the hashtag thread ends. Now our next step is to attach these to the mask. What I do to attach these to the mask is I measure them lengthwise and mark about halfway. These are 28 inches, half of 28 is 14. So a little blue line goes on the 14 mark in both of these. Now with the mask, what you want to do to encase these in is, say this is the end of the mask right here. We put the string in and we fold it over. We fold it over again and the seam goes right along here. Now I mark the halfway point. You're thinking logically that, hey, maybe it would want to go halfway in the mask. For me, the going around the top of my head needs a little bit more string than down around the neck. So I put this halfway mark line within the seam allowance of the top of the mask. And I fold it over once, fold it over twice. Time to pin it. Now to stitch through the whole thickness. Always take extra time to make sure it's perfectly right before it goes under the machine. Because once it's under the machine, there's not a lot of freedom in fixing things. The needle goes down through the entire thickness. There we go. Seam done. Now to do the other side with the same process. That's hanging out. As I said, you want to make sure everything's perfect before it goes under the machine. Now to take it to the ironing board. Now to meld the stitches and do the finishing touches. Time to snip the hashtag thread ends. To get any final wrinkles out of the final product. Here we go. Thank you for joining me today at Stitch in Time. My name is Michael Lianos, and it's my mission to make sewing approachable to the hobbyist. I hope today inspired you to get sewing. If it did, make sure to like and subscribe. See you soon.